Here we are on a fragile blue planet, spinning silently around a star, floating in a universe that is vast, dark, and mostly indifferent to us. For most of human history, we didn't know why lightning split the sky, why the sun rose each morning, or where life itself had come from. We only knew that we were small, vulnerable, and surrounded by forces far greater than ourselves. And when people don't know things, they invent stories, not because they are foolish or naive, but because silence is terrifying. The unknown presses on the human mind like a weight. We are meaning-seeking creatures. Uncertainty feels unbearable, and so we fill the gaps. That is how religions were born, not from eternal truths, but from fear, from confusion, from the desperate need to feel in control of a world that seemed uncontrollable. Think of a child. When a child doesn't understand why their parent is angry, they often assume it must be their fault. They conclude that they did something wrong. In the same way, early humans didn't understand droughts, diseases, or floods. When nature struck, they believed it must be punishment. Someone or something must have been offended. This wasn't a failure of morality. It was simply the human brain doing what it always does, trying to make sense of chaos. If the storm has a purpose, if the river has a spirit, if the drought is the will of a god, then maybe, just maybe, we can do something about it. And so rituals began. Offerings were made, fires were lit, dances were performed. If people thought they could stop suffering by pleasing the unseen forces behind it, they would try anything. Religion offered the first framework. It made the world feel less random. If crops failed, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a message, a warning. The gods were angry, and there was something to fix. That gave people not only explanations, but also a strange, comforting illusion of control. Instead of chaos, they now had a system. Do this, avoid that, follow the ritual, obey the command, and maybe the world will make sense again. But once these stories took root, they began to serve other purposes, purposes that had little to do with truth. Leaders quickly realized that religion could organize people. If you could convince a population that your authority came not from yourself but from the heavens, then obedience was no longer just about loyalty. It was about morality. It was about eternal consequence. To disobey you wasn't merely rebellion against a king or a chief. It was disobedience to the cosmos itself. You don't need swords when you can make people believe that disobedience is a sin. That is how temples became political centers. That is why priests stood beside kings. Not because they discovered some transcendent truth, but because they offered something even more powerful, control wrapped in faith. Religions spread not because they were true, but because they were useful. Useful to rulers, who could justify their authority. Useful to everyday people, who found identity, order, and comfort in belonging to something greater than themselves. Religion gave people a story that said, this is who you are, this is how you should live, this is who you must fear. It drew invisible lines between the clean and the unclean, the believer and the outsider, and those lines created tribes. Tribes created loyalty, and loyalty made people easier to manage. You don't need to wonder why religion was invented. You just need to see how it functions. It explains the unexplainable. It justifies authority. It defines morality, and it divides the world into us and them. These aren't accidents, they are features. One of religion's most effective tricks was to claim that it was eternal, that it always existed, that it wasn't invented at all, but revealed, that it came from the skies, from a god, from a sacred book. But everything we know has a beginning, and religions are no different. They were crafted by people, written, rewritten, and reshaped across generations. The gods changed names, rituals were modified, texts were edited, stories were borrowed from older traditions. And yet people were told that these systems were permanent, unchanging, eternal. But if religion were truly unchanging, we wouldn't have thousands of them. We wouldn't see gods who obsess over dietary habits in one part of the world and ignore them completely in another. We wouldn't have holy wars fought between people who each claim to worship peace. The very variety of religion proves its human origin. If there were one truth, we wouldn't still be arguing over it thousands of years later. Many religions emerged not just to explain storms or floods, but to confront the greatest mystery of all, death. The finality of death is almost impossible to accept. It makes life feel unbearably short, sometimes meaningless. Religion softened that blow. It promised a second chance, an afterlife, rebirth, eternal reward, or eternal punishment. These ideas were not discovered. They were invented. They were stories crafted to make people feel better and to control how they behaved before they died. Others emerged to regulate behavior in growing societies. When groups were small, survival was built on face-to-face trust. But as tribes became cities, people needed shared rules, and rules need enforcement. Religion stepped in. Now if you broke a law, it wasn't just a crime, it was an offense against a divine power. Even if no human saw you, someone always was. A god, an ancestor, a spirit. And that idea changed everything. Religion became a surveillance system long before technology existed. It also became a balm for suffering. When bad things happened, people wanted to believe it wasn't meaningless. That pain had a purpose. That injustice would one day be corrected. That those who suffered now would be rewarded later. But this comfort had a cost. If you believe justice is coming after death, you're less likely to fight for justice in life. That passivity served those in charge very well. The most successful religions in history were the ones that balanced fear with hope. They promised safety, love, eternal peace, if you obeyed. And if you didn't, punishment, fire, torment, exclusion. The price of disbelief was too high. That's not a system built on evidence. That's a system built on coercion. Even today, many beliefs stay alive, not because they are reasonable, but because they are ingrained. People are taught them before they even know how to think critically. The beliefs are handed down like heirlooms, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, wrapped in tradition and emotion. If a child is told from birth that a certain book is sacred, or that a ritual is holy, or that a god is always watching, they'll believe it before they ever learn to question anything at all. That isn't faith, that's conditioning. And when belief becomes part of your identity, it stops being just an idea. To question it feels like questioning your family, your culture, your entire community. Even when doubts appear, they get buried. Religion protects itself by making disbelief feel like betrayal. Some argue that religion gave us morality, that without divine commandments, people wouldn't know how to live, how to treat one another. But this isn't true. Morality existed long before religion formalized it. Cooperation, empathy, fairness, these traits are part of human survival. They existed in tribes long before scriptures were written. What religion often did was take ordinary human decency and rebrand it as divine law, as if kindness only counts if it's commanded, as if compassion only matters if it comes from fear of punishment. But morality does not need myths to stand. It thrives when people understand each other, not when they tremble under threats from above. And history shows something darker. Some of the worst crimes humanity has ever committed were done with religious approval. Slavery, genocide, oppression. These weren't mistakes. They were defended, even demanded by doctrine. Holy texts were quoted to justify cruelty. Temples blessed armies. Priests crowned conquerors. Religion has always claimed to guide morality, but too often it has been used to excuse immorality. It also reinforced structures of power, especially patriarchy. Many religions placed men at the top, prophets, priests, gods, while women were told to obey, to submit, to serve. Scriptures painted women as temptations, as weaker vessels, as followers rather than leaders. Their choices were restricted, their voices silenced, their bodies controlled. This wasn't revelation, it was design. These systems were built by men, in societies already steeped in male authority. Religion didn't just reflect patriarchy, it fortified it, cloaked it in holiness, made it feel eternal. The same is true for wealth. Religious institutions have always preached detachment from material things, while collecting vast amounts of them. Golden temples, jeweled altars, vast landholdings, tithes from the poor. Today, televangelists fly in private jets while preaching humility. The irony isn't hidden, it's ignored. Because religion, for all its language of spirit, has always been a business, and businesses adapt. Religions have never been static. They evolve, absorbing old traditions, rewriting old texts, reshaping rituals to suit new times. Holidays were borrowed from older faiths, symbols were recycled, festivals were rebranded, entire gods were renamed or merged. This patchwork history is rarely acknowledged, but it reveals something crucial. Religions weren't born fully formed. They were stitched together, piece by piece, often for political convenience. Consider monotheism. For much of human history, people believed in many gods. Each god was tied to a force of nature, a part of life, a local tradition. But as societies expanded into empires, one god became more efficient. One supreme ruler in the heavens matched one supreme ruler on earth. Monotheism wasn't the result of discovering deeper truth. It was the result of centralizing power. Religion, in other words, evolved to match the needs of the people in power. In times of war, scriptures emphasized sacrifice, obedience, and loyalty. In patriarchal cultures, commandments reinforced male dominance. In desert regions, dietary laws just happened to match what was safe to eat. These weren't cosmic truths, they were local strategies, frozen in sacred texts. And yet they're still treated as universal laws. But history keeps moving, and the cracks in religion's authority became harder to hide once science entered the picture. Lightning was no longer a divine punishment, it was electricity. Disease wasn't the work of demons, it was caused by microbes. The earth wasn't flat, and it wasn't the center of the universe. Science began to replace the roles religion once played. It explained the physical world without invoking gods. Slowly, religion retreated. Instead of explaining how the world works, it shifted to answering why we are here. But even in that space, its answers remained the same. Stories without evidence, myths without proof, authority without accountability. Still, religion offered something powerful: comfort. Comfort in the face of suffering, comfort in the face of death, comfort in believing that pain had meaning, that injustice would one day be reversed, that death wasn't the end. This comfort mattered. It helped people endure unbearable lives, but it also kept people passive. If justice will come in the afterlife, why fight for it here? If suffering has a divine purpose, why resist it? This logic kept people enduring conditions that might otherwise have sparked revolt. Throughout history, the most successful religions were those that blended fear and hope in just the right amounts. They promised safety, love, eternal peace, but only if you obeyed, and if you didn't, the punishment was unbearable. Fire, exile, torment. That isn't a system of truth, it's a system of control. And it persists not because the stories are convincing, but because they are ingrained into the deepest parts of culture. Religion doesn't just live in sacred books. It lives in rituals, in traditions, in the calendar of holidays, in the words we say at weddings and funerals. It lives in the rhythms of daily life, woven into identity so thoroughly that to step outside it feels impossible. Birth, marriage, death. These milestones became fused with religion, so even if you doubted the teachings, you couldn't easily separate yourself from the rituals. To be human was to be religious, at least on the surface, and that emotional tether made questioning harder. Religion also promised not just comfort, but protection from other religions. If your group was chosen, then outsiders must be wrong. If your God was true, theirs must be false. That logic led to conflict, to holy wars, to centuries of distrust. Wars weren't fought because of truth. They were fought because of incompatible claims that no one was allowed to question, and rulers used those claims to justify conquest. Colonialism became sacred when it was said to be God's will. Violence became holy when enemies were declared evil. Religion was not misunderstood. It was designed in ways that made this manipulation easy. Scarcity played a role too. In times when resources were scarce, people believed survival depended on divine favor. If crops failed, it wasn't weather, it was a moral failure. If a plague spread, it was a curse. This belief punished the poor for their misfortunes, while giving credit to the gods, not to human ingenuity, when things went well. Progress slowed under this mindset, because human effort was downplayed. Why study medicine if illness comes from sin? Why investigate the stars if the heavens are already explained in sacred texts? And yet, once science began offering real answers, religion had to shift again. It pulled back from explaining the natural world and doubled down on moral and existential authority. It stopped asking us to look outward at thunder and disease and began demanding we look inward at meaning and morality. But even there, it claimed ownership over things it did not invent. Love, kindness, fairness. These don't need gods to exist. They arise from our nature, from our social bonds, from empathy. Religion simply claimed them, branded them, and told us they only matter if commanded from above. But the truth is, we can be good without gods, we can be moral without myths, we can be kind without fear of punishment. Even now, religion remains powerful, not because it holds truth, but because it holds sway. It appeals not to reason, but to emotion. It clings not to evidence, but to tradition. It survives because it is familiar, because it is stitched into identity, because questioning it feels like betrayal. Look closely at how it works today. Religious institutions still shape elections, pass laws, and silence dissent. They influence education, dictate policies on women's rights, and impose restrictions on love and identity. The language of faith still enters courtrooms and parliaments, as if ancient texts should guide modern lives. And when someone dares to ask questions, where did this belief come from? Who benefits from it? Why hasn't it changed? The response is often outrage, as if curiosity itself were dangerous. That reaction is not an accident. It's the result of centuries of conditioning. Religion was designed to be beyond reproach. That's why it claims divine origin. That's why it insists it wasn't written by humans, but revealed by gods. Because once you say something is eternal and untouchable, it becomes harder to challenge. But if you examine religious texts closely, you see the fingerprints of the authors. You see edits, contradictions, and very human concerns. Rules that reflect local conditions, dietary laws shaped by geography, gender laws shaped by patriarchy, wartime scriptures calling for loyalty and sacrifice. These aren't universal truths. They are snapshots of specific times and places, elevated into eternal commandments. Even the idea of one God, something many today see as natural, was once a radical invention. Earlier societies had gods for every aspect of life, but as empires grew, the logic of one king in heaven mirrored the logic of one king on earth. Monotheism was efficient. It simplified belief, centralized power, and strengthened authority. This doesn't mean religion was useless. It served functions. It helped people cope with injustice. If you were poor and powerless, it was comforting to believe the rich and cruel would be punished later, that your suffering was temporary, that heaven was waiting. This belief kept hope alive, but it also discouraged resistance. It told the suffering to endure instead of change their conditions. That is why religion has so often reinforced inequality. It explained away poverty as divine will. It sanctified hierarchy. It justified oppression. And in many parts of the world, it still does. Children are told not to ask too many questions. Women are told their role is to obey. LGBTQ people are told they are broken. These ideas don't come from evidence. They come from books written in times when slavery was common, when science didn't exist, when the earth was believed to be flat. And yet those books still shape modern lives. When defenders are challenged, they often fall back on tradition. This is how it has always been. But tradition is not morality. Longevity is not proof of truth. Many things that endured, racism, sexism, violence, were traditions too. Survival does not sanctify. Religious institutions also tied themselves to the most emotional moments in human life: birth, marriage, and death. These milestones became rituals, and rituals became anchors. Even those who doubted the teachings often stayed for the ceremonies, because religion wasn't just about belief, it was about belonging, about being part of something at the moments when we feel most vulnerable. This emotional tether is powerful. It binds people not with logic, but with ritual, not with truth, but with comfort. And it makes walking away almost unthinkable. Religion also thrives on division. By promising protection from outsiders, it fueled cycles of distrust and conflict. If your group was chosen, others were condemned. If your God was true, theirs must be false. This logic has fueled centuries of holy wars, persecution, and violence. Not because people misunderstood their religions, but because the very structure of religion invites this clash. Competing claims, each presented as unquestionable, inevitably collide. Throughout history, rulers used this to their advantage. When you say God wants land, conquest becomes sacred. When you say your enemies are evil, violence becomes holy. That is how religion was weaponized. Easily, repeatedly, deliberately. Scarcity made religion even more potent. When food was scarce, when survival was fragile, divine favor was seen as the difference between life and death. A failed harvest wasn't weather, it was moral failure. This punished the unlucky while rewarding the powerful. Innovation slowed, because the causes of events were assigned to gods rather than to human agency. But slowly, science replaced superstition. Astronomy revealed the heavens were not divine palaces but galaxies and stars. Medicine proved that disease came from microbes, not curses. Technology made survival less dependent on pleasing spirits and more dependent on human effort. Religion retreated. It stopped explaining how the world worked, because science did that better. Instead, it shifted to the realm of why. Why are we here? What is our purpose? How should we live? But even here, religion claimed too much. It insisted that meaning could only come from outside us, that we must be part of a cosmic plan, that our value depends on being noticed by a god. But meaning does not need to be imported from the heavens. Meaning can be created by us. Through love, through art, through learning, through kindness, through struggle. Religion didn't invent meaning, it just claimed ownership of it. Some say religion is necessary for hope, but hope does not need myths. Real hope comes from action. building systems that help people, solving problems instead of praying them away. Real hope comes from knowledge, from cooperation, from progress. Others say religion provides comfort, and it does. But so do friendships, stories, therapy, and community. Comfort is important. But there's a difference between the comfort of truth and the comfort of illusion. One heals, the other numbs. At its core, religion is a story humans told themselves to survive uncertainty. It helped us when we knew little. It gave us answers when silence was unbearable. It helped us endure when life was brutal. But we are not the same species we were thousands of years ago. We have science, medicine, technology, psychology. We have tools that work better than myths, tools that don't require fear, tools that unite rather than divide. Religion came from a time when we didn't know better, but now we do. We can see its human origins, we can trace its evolution, we can understand its functions, and with that understanding comes freedom, the freedom to choose differently. We don't need gods to be kind, we don't need threats to be moral, we don't need myths to be connected. What we need is honesty, courage, and the willingness to ask hard questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable. Religion shaped societies, but it also held them back. It offered answers, but it discouraged questions. It promised meaning, but often denied freedom. The real challenge now is not to ask why religion was created. We know that. The question is why it still holds so much power, and whether we are ready to build something better, something based on truth, not fear, on understanding, not superstition, on courage, not obedience. We can be human without pretending to be part of a divine experiment. We can be moral without waiting for cosmic approval. We can find meaning in love, in creation, in knowledge, in struggle, without needing the universe to script it for us. Because the universe is vast and silent. It does not whisper instructions. It does not demand rituals. It does not divide us into chosen and condemned. It simply is, and in that silence, we are free. Free to write our own stories, free to create our own meaning, free to live, not in fear of gods, but in awe of existence itself. So perhaps the better question is not why humans invented religion. We know the answer to that. We invented it because we needed it. The real question now is, do we still need it? Or are we finally ready to step beyond it and see what kind of world we can build when the myths fall silent and the truth is enough? Religion began as a story to quiet the fear of the unknown, but today we no longer need myths to explain the sky, to cure disease, or to guide our morality. What we need is honesty, courage, and the willingness to ask questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable. And if you've watched this far, maybe you feel the same. Maybe you too are ready to look at the structures around us, not as eternal truths, but as human inventions, fragile, imperfect, and ready to be replaced with something better. The future doesn't have to be written in ancient texts. It can be written by us, through empathy, through reason, through action. Because meaning doesn't need to come from the heavens. It can come from us, here and now. Thank you for watching and for daring to question. If this video spoke to you, share it with someone who still believes the old answers are enough. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the questions that shape who we are and where we're going. And let me know in the comments, what do you think humanity can build once we no longer need myths to hold us together? Stay curious, stay honest, and never stop asking where your beliefs come from, because only by questioning can we ever be free.